Welcome everyone. Today we have our new episode and we have a very exclusive debate. We have our debate on this house belief that companies should be taxed on their carbon emissions and other negative environmental impact. From the government side, we have our honorable speaker, Professor Rob. From opposition side, we have our honorable speaker, Professor David Smith. Mr. Marshall, from the government side, if Mr. Donald join, he can go for oppositions. First, I want to give chance, Professor Rob.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. This House believes that companies should be taxed on their carbon emissions and other negative environmental impacts. What we're proposing here is that companies pay for the damage that they do. This doesn't mean that an oil company would pay for the ecological impacts of the engines that produce smog. They would pay for the damage they do with regard to drilling. If they're not doing any damage with regard to drilling and it's contained on their own property and doesn't spread to aquifers, then their tax would be mitigated. If they put in technology that offsets the damage that they're doing, then that tax would be mitigated. So the tax is in lieu of actually solving the problem at the source. If we go to the car companies and their manufacturing, and most of the car companies are powered by electricity, though they do use some natural gas and oil and parts, and then they're taxed based on what that plant pollutes. Again, if they convert to a more sustainable energy source, the tax is reduced so they are incented consistently to be sustainable. And then with regard to gasoline cars, the car owners are taxed based on the pollution that those cars produce. Now that does, with automobiles and individuals, that does create a problem because the people that have the most polluting automobiles are often the people that have the least amount of money. And what we suggest here is incentives to buy back those vehicles and either replace them with credits on public transportation or credits towards a more a greener technology. Now, we do need to model this, and part of these taxes will go to simulation and modeling to see what the overall impact, not only on the environment is going to be, but what the economic impact on the country is, and allow the various implementing bodies some flexibility so that the taxes aren't wiping out industries and wiping out jobs wholesale. That's not the goal here. The goal is to create balance. So if a company creates damage, they either pay to correct the damage via tax, and that tax money is largely going to carbon capture or some other methodology to clean up the damage, or they pay to clean up the damage themselves and thus mitigate the tax. We do recognize that a taxing mechanism is highly inefficient. They pay us the tax. We have administrative responsibilities. We have infrastructure we have to build, and the rest of it. And so, not all the money that we're collecting from taxes is going to correct the problem. But if the company spends that money themselves to correct the problem, that they'll probably be more effective dollar for dollar. So the idea is to promote the company to correct the problems themselves or to do things that are less damaging, not necessarily make this a revenue source for the government. My preference would be we not be in the pollution mitigation business. We let the companies mitigate the pollution themselves and then incent them to do that aggressively. As we talk about looking at pollution that is created overseas and comes across borders, here, rather than going into trade wars or using tariffs in those fashions, tariffs could be used to cover pollution that's coming in across borders. So we do certainly mitigate some of those efforts, but we're not proposing that we use tariffs and those methodologies to change the way a government regulates its own population. We might want to do that in a different discussion, but in this discussion, we're simply talking about applying our regulatory controls to mitigating pollution, and specifically into keeping our country from being more polluted, making sure that our citizens have clean water, clean air, and safe food. So anybody that compromises those three elements pays to correct that compromise, with the emphasis being on making sure that they don't compromise in the first place. If our industries are by nature clean, then we don't have a problem, and that's where we'd like to be. We'd like to be out of the pollution business and let the companies correct it. But we do need to moderate. We can't let the companies self-enforce. That's been problematic for us in the past. So we do need to put together a regulatory agency that moderates the level of pollution and then applies the incentives and the taxes as needed to promote the behavior that we want. We also suggest that we hold up companies and industries that are doing a great job and provide a way to provide financial incentives for those in terms of awards, recognition, and status. In some ways, we may model some of the things that are happening in Singapore, where they're applying heavy taxes to environments that pollute. For instance, their taxes on automobiles are incredibly high to offset and push people into public transportation, which they can regulate, and it's a far greener technology. And we can look at what the United States is doing currently with the SEC and requiring companies to actively report on their sustainable efforts and the level of pollutants they have. And with the same emphasis we have on regulating our own stock market, use those enforcement mechanisms to ensure that those reports are accurate and correct. So it starts with knowing where we are and who is polluting, and the overall effort is to stop the pollution. It's not to punish people, it's to stop the pollution and move our industries into more sustainable areas over time, and use the money we collect to correct the problems that are being created, or to motivate the industry to not creating the problem in the first place. That's our proposal.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rob. Now I request Professor David Smith from the opposition side.
And Professor Rob, thank you for your opening comments. I always enjoy hearing your arguments and great statistics, even though sometimes they are circular. I loved how you finished your argument with our job is to regulate the companies that pollute and to bring them into compliance. I think the key word in this debate is the word regulate, because there's a difference between regulate a company to bring it in compliance and put in place a very progressive tax, a tax that's going to affect our economy, a tax that, like most taxes we've seen in this country under the leadership currently, once a tax is implemented, it never goes away. It only has one path. It goes up. And our citizens already are heavily taxed as it is. And we know that it's there. One of the problems with a carbon tax is regressive. By making fossil fuels more expensive, impose a harsher burden on those with low income. They'll pay a higher percentage of their income for necessities like gas, electricity, and food. They can't afford to switch to electric vehicles like you proposed in your opening comments. Should we pay attention to climate change? 100%. But we can look at through the regulatory paths, which you spoke about as a way to get there, as opposed to a really very regressive tax that is being put on these. And you cite Singapore as an example with their automobile tax. And then you said in your opening comments, Singapore's goal is to get people out of their cars and get them into public transportation, and I quote, where the government can regulate them. And, that is the fear of the opposition here, is that we put in place this very regressive carbon tax, and that it stays there. And the real goal of the government is to regulate us into other ways to do it. It's going to really very much put a harsh burden on those with low incomes in those. And if we're going to do a carbon tax type of approach, one that where it can begin to be implemented gradually, let people shift, let them go do other things. But we need to look at where the revenues go. And the example of the revenues go are kind of interesting. In the United States and EU and other places, it's been proposed that if you do take regulatory action against individual companies as a regulated penalty for the greenhouse gas emissions and things, that money should be rebated back to the citizens of the country, as opposed to going into a government coffer to be able to use it. The other thing that you know is that as we do this, costs are going to go up as well. So if I go ahead and put carbon taxes against the oil companies, gasoline's going to go up. The cost of oil to heat our homes are going to go up. You're going to see all that happen. But the problem we have is that just a carbon tax by itself is probably not enough of an increase to make a significant dent in CO2 emissions. And we would need to begin to do other things to help close that gap. Some of the things proposed in some other countries around the world, when you look at best practices, as opposed to a carbon tax, it might be used a cap and trade system, where a cap and trade system is designed to reduce pollution by setting a maximum level pollution, otherwise known as the cap that can be given by a given industry or given company. And then that cap is divided among each company to set a maximum amount, an allowable. And they can trade those around, but the goal is to establish the cap, have those industries responsible for meeting the cap. And if they don't do it, then use our regulatory functions of our Congress to take action against them. And this is a way where it's not quite as regressive as a tax that we know is going to affect everyone across the nation. And you begin to see, and like I said, you don't see them go away. The other real important part in this is you begin to look at places where things have been implemented, and you see the taxes minimally effective. Raising money, yes, but minimally effective where you can see the results in reducing economy. If you begin to look at the director of Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, Dr. Kaufman, he really says it's a feature rather than a bug of the carbon tax policy that effects are concentrated in just a couple of industries. And that because of that, it carries unfair burdens against the economy of the nation. Should we affect greenhouse emissions? 100%. But we need to do it intelligent. We need not to cripple our economy. We need to not penalize the low income, the moderate income in this nation. We need to look at ways to implement it in a manner where we can effectively regulate the greenhouse gases. But we also need to partner. You said earlier that a lot of our greenhouse pollution comes across the border. We agree with you. And so how do we work as part of an international coalition to reduce them? Our carbon tax is not going to affect those outside our border. So how can we work together to put effective international regulation in place that can address this critical problem for our nation? And is action needed? 1,000%. But let's look at the other options. Let's look at those that are fairer, that do not hurt our economy, that is just now recovering from this COVID pandemic. Let's look at other things we can do where we look at mechanisms that do not constitute long-term taxes that once again will impact our nation in ways that we cannot even understand yet because of how this impacts manufacturing, how it affects tourism, how it affects transportation, all the different elements of our nation. So we are very open to debate going through here, but let's look at the other solutions that do not impact our nation severely. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Professor David Speed. Before I give chance to our Honorable Minister, Mr. Marshall, Professor David Jekali, what side you want to go, government or opposition?
What side was David Smith on?
Opposition.
Yeah, I think I'm on the opposition.
Okay.
My biggest concern about just taxes is, first of all, the government is already irresponsible with it, at least the American government.
Yes.
And taxes in general, I think, are just out of control. I mean, you
Yes.
just take a look at my taxes last year was like 150 pages long, my tax return. I mean, come on.
Okay.
You know,
Dr. David J. Kelly, we will give you floor because this is a parliamentary debate format. You are in parliament, so you will be opposition deputy leader as you join few minutes later. That's why
what
I
does
give you
that
a chance.
mean?
It's a parliamentary debate. It's a mock parliament. Yes.
Go
I'm
ahead,
not
your
sure.
turn. You're not up yet.
Oh,
Yes.
And I guess
Okay.
that makes me be on the, I guess that makes me be on the pro side, on the government side, right? I haven't
Okay.
selected a side either. Whatever I can do either side easily on this.
Okay.
one.
You are government. So
Okay, whichever side you need me to be on, I'll be on it.
I
Okay,
think we had Marshall set up to be government and Donald was set up to be opposition.
opposition.
Okay, I'll be opposition, fine.
Okay. And Mr. David J. Kelly also oppositions.
so you want me to
Okay.
tell you my position?
It's only
Right.
fair.
No.
Not
all
yet.
going to be-
It's Marshall's turn. Well, you'll
Okay.
come after Donald.
Oh,
Yes. Okay. Mr. Marshall.
Okay, just for clarity's sake, we're in a what's called a mock debate, David. In I don't know if you've ever been in a debating society, but
No.
we're very proud of the fact that a lot of debating societies around the world follow this forum, and they know the rules. So the rules are that there's a prime minister, an opposition leader, and then each. Oh, hold on. Am I here? Yeah, I'm back. Okay.
You're back.
Somebody tried calling me. So basically that's what's going on. We have these debates. So I'm acting as the senior minister for sustainability for the government. And we're in a country that's not the United States, just for clarity's sake.
Okay.
A lot of people think we're in the United States. We're not. This mock debate means that we're in a small country, and we have to debate the topic. The topic at debate is should there be carbon taxes or not? And the government's position is there should be carbon taxes. The opposition says there should not. But I think Professor David Smith presented a great position on the opposition, and actually said that pro-offered the position of carbon tax. What I want to, as the head of sustainability, the Ministry of Sustainability, we've been tasked by the government to look into issuing carbon taxes for our country, and there are a number of issues which the opposition brought up, and as the old expression is, we're in violent agreement. So what that means is that there's a lot of things that the opposition brought up that are relevant, and we need to engage in that process. As the Minister of Sustainability, we are seeking input from both the opposition and other members of our community and our citizens in this carbon tax discussion. Essentially, people need to know the facts. On their own, as the opposition has said, carbon taxes are generally seen as regressive taxes, and that is typically not what the government is seeking to do. So how does one go about issuing a carbon tax? What is its purpose? How should it be designed, and what would the impacts be? And that's what we're here to debate. So as our Prime Minister elucidated, he did say that we need carbon taxes, and I like the fact that the opposition said that we have a circular reasoning, because guess what? We're trying to get a circular economy. We're trying to take waste and convert it into a resource so that it can create energy in lieu of the fossil fuels that we're importing and the natural gas that we're importing to our country. So and the pollution that it lends to our citizens. So what is the mission of the government? The government is to is not just generally about carbon taxes in and of themselves. The mission is to lower pollution for our citizens in our country. And in order to do that, we need to come up with some tools that help mitigate that pollution and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are overwhelming our economy and our citizens. To do that, the government is looking obviously at instituting carbon tax. Now, just for everybody's sake, research does show, and we've done the research in our ministry, that carbon taxes effectively reduce emissions. There are, I'm trying to remember how many countries, I have my notes here. As of 2019, carbon taxes have been implemented or scheduled for implementation in 25 countries, while 46 countries put some form of price on carbon, either through a carbon tax emission or some trading scheme. So as the opposition has pointed out, perhaps they favor a trading scheme. It is our contention that we need a combination of both. And we need to offset the regressiveness of a carbon tax. We do recognize that carbon tax in and of itself could be regressive. But there are examples out in the world where people are implementing carbon taxes and they're offsetting that, such as tax credits for citizens, for lower income citizens, also an ability to, as our prime minister pointed out, to fund the ability to purchase the emitting cars if we're talking at the consumer level. I think more important for the country and the nation, for our small nation, we need to look at our importers of oil and gas, and also the power generation systems, our coal-fired power plants that we have in our country. Those technologies need a carbon tax because the carbon tax is there to incentivize them to convert their coal-fired power plants into other means of energy and energy production. So there are obviously the big ones that we know about that we've seen around the world are solar arrays, especially in countries where there's a lot of, especially in countries where there's a lot of sun. But even in a country like England, they do have they're setting up a carbon tax that doesn't have as much sun, let's say, as Saudi Arabia. So, and they are using solar arrays. The new solar technology is much more efficient. It has its own issues. It may need a carbon tax on itself, just in the production of the solar panels, because of the production capabilities. But all of that is changing. We need to roll with the times, folks. And so to do that, the government proposes a combination of trading schemes and carbon taxes that are non-regressive, and there are mechanisms. And there are other countries that are doing this, and it's not a perfect world. Nobody's saying it is, but we need to act now. The IPCC report of February 28th, that's what, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, enumerates, in fact, that we are in big trouble. Our country is in trouble. The planet is in trouble. And as the honorable opposition pointed out, pollution crosses borders. It doesn't stop at our country's borders. It doesn't go to it doesn't need a passport to get across. It just goes, and vice versa. So we need to be a part of a coalition of like-minded countries. And as part of the carbon sequestration of 2015, I believe our government did sign that protocol, and we need to be a part of that. And in order to do that, we need to do our fair share and our fair part. What we need to do, ensure, is that it's not an unfair burden upon our citizenry. In order to do that, carbon taxes need to be implemented in a way that aligns through treaties with other countries that share in this problem. And as I said, the IPCC report says it's bad news, and we're gonna have the effects. Children have more asthma in our country than ever before, and that's because of greenhouse gas emissions. And by the way, most people think of greenhouse gas emissions as carbon dioxide, CO2, but it includes also nitrous oxide and other emissions, and we should tax those as well. So we need to put in place a tax that is non-regressive, that at the same time will create a capability to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions and the pollution that is causing problems, and the rising water levels and the droughts and the swings in temperature in our country and around the world. Because what happens in one other part of the world affects us directly. So we need to think about this from a global point of view, but also a local point of view. And as the Minister of Sustainability for our country, we are working together with other countries, having discussions to make ensure that we help and have our voice heard in the forums to make sure that whatever happens out there in other countries is to our benefit as well as to the benefit of their country citizens. All citizens will be granted the same ability to have a healthier life. That's the promise of our government. Healthier life and less. By the way, a little lower healthcare costs. Just as another sidebar. But the issue here on the carbon tax is it needs to be non-regressive, and there are means to do that. I'm not going to go at this point because we have this debate, and I have to give the opposition time to counter me. But if I get another round, or if our Prime Minister certainly will have another round, he'll be able to counter the concepts of why it won't have to be a regressive tax, and at the same time why we can do this in a way that is not a zero-sum game. In other words, they win, we lose, or vice versa. In this case, the government is calling on the coalition to create a coalition of sustainability with our opposition. The opposition leader, David Smith, brought up some very intrinsic and important issues that we need to address. But just to say that carbon tax is bad, it belies the point, because carbon taxes, they're a tool. It's like if you're going to go for surgery and you're going to make the determination whether you're going to use this surgeon or that surgeon, and you ask the surgeon, what kind of scope do you use? Do you use a Siemens scope or GE scope to perform your surgery? That's a tool. You don't judge based on the tool. You based upon the surgeon's capability to bring the patient back to health. In this case, our country needs brought back to health, and the surgeon should be a surgical team, just like on a heart surgery or brain surgery. And we invite the opposition to join us in this forum to form a coalition on sustainability, because it's that big a deal. It's that important for our country and for the world. And we need to act now, because the climate crisis is here. The IPCC report of February 28th wrote up a very stark outcome, but gave us a very narrow window of opportunity in which to act. And if we act now together in concert, we can overcome the overriding issue. Taxes will not be an issue if we're all dying or being polluted or getting infected with types of zoonotic diseases, which is caused by climate crisis, or that we're increasing cancer rates in our country because of pollution. We know that pollution causes different types of cancers. We need to reduce that. Our healthcare burden in this country is getting untenable, and we are working. We see that it combines with healthcare, and carbon tax can help towards that. But not only a carbon tax, there are other tools, such as trading schemes that we would recommend together with our carbon tax. And on that note, I'll let the opposition follow.
Thank you, Honorable Minister of the Parliament. Now I request Opposition Deputy Leader, Professor Donald.
You're muted.
I think that there's a number of points about it, but the central point against carbon taxes is you have to ask the question first: does it work? We can have all these highfalutin ideas, but without empirical evidence, what are we doing? I mean, we could just go out and do things because we have a belief that they seem like right things and good things to do, and they're logical things. But the fact of the matter is, in Norway, when they implemented, their carbon dioxide emissions increased. They didn't decrease. And a number of countries that have done this, their carbon dioxide emissions didn't go down. The only in Denmark they went down, but they were doing a number of other things at the same time. So it's difficult to figure out whether the carbon dioxide emissions in Denmark went down because of the carbon taxes. So when you really think of our country is a developing country. It's not complete. It's not like the United States where everyone has power and natural gas and all the wonderful. We still use coal, and sometimes people use trash for power to heat their homes. And those have a lot more carbon dioxide than electricity that's generated by natural gas. Natural gas is the least carbon dioxide of any fossil source of fossil fuel. So if we start raising the prices of fossil fuels so that fossil fuel becomes so expensive that people can't really afford it, then people are going to go back to the less expensive means of fuel, and the amount of pollution that they make is actually going to go up. So there's a question about an empirical question that needs to be answered. Is doing carbon taxes actually going to reduce the carbon dioxide? And right now, when we look at places that have been doing it, the answer is not clear. What is clear is that what others have brought up is the regressive taxation. And what we're doing here is we're basically taking a large amount of money and taking it from the people of our country. And we're taking it equally from the rich and the poor. And what's that great saying that in a democracy, everything is equal, that both the rich and the poor have the ability, have the right to starve and sleep under bridges. I mean, we're totally fair. And so in the case of this, we're taking the same amount of money from both. And we can redistribute the money, but that's tricky. I mean, recently in the United States, a country with every sort of ability to do big data and to be able to monitor their economy and so on, they recently distributed money to help with COVID, and they ignited inflation in their country. So it's a tricky thing to be able to do, and there tends to be moral hazard in something like that. So we don't know that the money is going to actually get distributed to the people that need it the most. It's very common for the money to get distributed to the people who have the ability to distribute the money. And the people that are distributing the money distribute it to themselves and their friends instead of the people who actually need it and deserve it. So we can't guarantee that that's where the money's going to go. And it works at different levels. It's not just a matter of how much you pay at the gas pump. When your groceries or any item that you buy, your furniture, whatever, is transferred from one place to another, it's transferred on a truck. And that truck uses gasoline, and that costs money, and that becomes part of the cost of what you buy. So every single solitary thing that you buy at a store winds up costing more. So the costs of a carbon tax percolate through the entire economy. And that means that the wages that they can pay, the amount of profit that a company makes starts going down. And the company has to ask the question, well, in order to be profitable, what can we do? And there's two things a company can do to be more profitable. It can have less expenses or it can have more revenue. And more revenue means it charges more for what it sells, and lower cost means basically it fires people. And neither one of them is a good situation for consumers and for the people in the country. And so raising the cost of carbon is going to cause one of those two things to happen. And even if the carbon taxes are redistributed, there's going to be a period where between the time the carbon taxes are started and the time when the money is distributed, if there was a possible way of distributing it that in a fair and equitable way, that where there's going to be a gap, and there's going to have to be a change in the country, and that will be a painful change. And others have proposed there's other possible solutions to this: cap and trade, other kinds of taxes, regulation, conversion to alternative energy like solar and wind and other types of energy that ultimately will phase out petroleum once and for all. And if we're going to invest resources and energy and time, that's what's got to be the long-term solution for what we're going to be able to do. And it's something that we can do gradually, and it will be far less disruptive for our economy. So that's the solution that we really need to take.
Thank you. Now I request Professor Roth from the government side as a member of the parliament, because you have two speakers, so you will get 7 minutes for speech.
Oh, good. Nice surprise. All right. So our Minister of Sustainability did put forth statistics that did show that carbon taxes do work, but I will agree that they don't often work. It really is a case of more of how you implement the tax than it is the tax itself. And as I stated in the outset, as my twin brother, the Prime Minister, stated at the outset, the goal here is to reduce pollution. That's our focus. It's not to increase taxes. We do agree with the opposition that a regressive tax is problematic for an environment where you have a wide disparity in socioeconomic levels. We're not going to try to punish the poor for for problems that wealthy companies have created. That would seem to be wrong. The carbon tax would be positioned as an endpoint penalty, but one of a number of tools in a diverse tool set. We're not a fan of cap and trade, only because it doesn't aggressively address the problem of pollution. It does potentially reduce it a bit, but our goal is to eliminate it. And let's be clear, in this particular case, we're not talking about global warming. We're talking about pollution directly. The goal here and the purpose of government is to assure clean air, clean water, and availability of food. That's the focus. In terms of climate change, China generates 30% of the world's pollution. We buy a lot of products from China. The part of the proposal would be to tax those products that are coming from industries in China that are creating the pollution, to both allow our cleaner companies inside the country to compete, but also allow cleaner companies from outside the country to more effectively compete as well. What we want to do is we want to incent products from clean countries, products from clean industries, and disincent products that are causing problems for us. Pollution as it exists is not a localized instance. For instance, California reports that a high percentage of their pollution is coming from China. There's nothing California can do to reduce China's emission directly. The only thing that they can do is disincent the purchase of products from China that create that pollution. That they can do through tariffs. So it's a broad-based proposal. Yes, carbon tax would be part of it, but carbon tax is only used in cases where no other methodology is being affected. If the company mitigates the pollution, they can use the money to mitigate that and offset or eliminate the carbon tax. The tax is only charged for what it is they cause. It is not charged based on industry. It is not charged based on what other people pollute using their products. For instance, as I said, as my twin brother said on the Parliament, if we have a petrochemical company and the petrochemical company is producing oil, and that oil in and of itself is not polluting, their process is not fracking and causing contamination of aquifers, then they're not taxed. But if the automotive industry that builds automobiles that aren't clean, they're not taxed for the cars. The car buyer, though, would then pay for the pollution that they create, and so it would be beneficial to the car company to reduce the pollutants in the car, because it lowers the cost of the car to the buyer, and they'll sell more cars. We create an economic environment where the money flows where we want it to flow. It flows to clean industries and it flows away from dirty industries. The goal is not to have people unemployed. The goal is to gradually transition our industries that are polluters to industries that are not polluters and stop the pollution. See, it does us no good to tax companies and give money back to the people for the taxes, because the people can't spend that money to clean their water, air, and provide food. That has to be done for them. The government's role is to do things citizens can't do for themselves. And right now, citizens, particularly lower economic areas, are not going to be able to buy carbon scrubbers, not be able to buy the kinds of filtration systems they're going to need to clean the polluted air and water, and they're certainly not going to be able to grow their own food right now. So we need to be able to step up and assure those things are provided to our citizens, so they have long, healthy lives, and they aren't as concerned about health problems that they are about the health problems they are today. So the carbon tax is only to be used as an absolute penalty against companies that refuse to comply, or if it is used against an industry that is, by nature is a pollutant. So, for instance, if you have a company that is only doing fracking and the methodology that they're using can't be done cleanly, that is something that perhaps we either tax them to a degree that they're far less profitable, or perhaps we even shut those industries down. The goal of this overall effort is to solve for pollution. It is not to generate revenue for the government. It is not to penalize the poor. It's not to penalize the rich either. It is simply to drive the behavior that we need to allow our citizens to live and survive. And there's one other issue going on in the world today that I think we ought to address, and that's the war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia is now threatening nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Those weapons produce pollutants that cross borders. I'm not suggesting at this particular point in time we send troops into Ukraine, but if Russia does something that damages the health and livelihood of our citizens, then we do have to move to mitigate it, certainly through sanctions and tariffs if possible. But if any country in the world is creating an environment that could cause a mass death event in our country, we need to move aggressively to mitigate that with every emphasis and power of the government, and that needs to be taken into consideration. So this administration is proposing we go to war with polluters and go to war with pollutants, and every effort, including the tax on emissions, is designed as a weapon against that war, so that we create a safe, healthy, and long-lived populace. The goal, again, is not taxation, and certainly we would want to avoid, like the opposition spoke about, regressive taxation. The goal is to use everything every arrow in our quiver, which includes taxes, to stop the pollutants that are making our people sick and are destroying the ability for our people to have a long, healthy life.
Thank you, Professor Rob. Now I request from the opposition side, opposition member of the parliament, Professor Dr. David J. Kelly.
So, on principle, I'm not necessarily against a carbon tax, but the issue is the government already taxes people too much, and just an arbitrary carbon tax, especially if it affects the general populace, is problematic. We don't want to shoot down our economy just so we can, cut down the, lower carbon emissions generally. We need to put it where it's going to have the most effectiveness, and not necessarily just willy-nilly. I mean, we need to have hard data. We need to, I think taxing corporations, I think is reasonable, but I think that if they're major pollutants, that is, but we do need to do it in such a way where we don't affect the economy, and that money needs to go to cleaning up the mess from an environmental standpoint. The whole thing gets down to the fact that we don't really have the ethical right to destroy the lives of others. And if we go and just tax like the poor people, for example, that's not really ethical when they can't really survive to begin with, hardly. But with corporations, when they are infringing on the rights of others by mucking up the environment, we should be, it's our job as a government to regulate that, to protect the population at large. But the problem is, can we do that in a way that will be effective? We can't just do it and hope it works. We've got to do it and know that it works. And I think that's not just a carbon tax, but a much more comprehensive strategy that needs to happen. And as a government, that's our job, to handle complex problems. And I think that's where we need to focus our efforts on actually solving the problem, and not necessarily just randomly creating new taxes when we already have too many. We need to be cutting taxes and fixing the environment, not randomly raising taxes and not even sure if it's going to work.
Thank you, Professor David J. Kelly. Now I request for the closing remarks. Leader of the oppositions, Professor Dr. David Smith.
Thank you so much. As we've heard from multiple people, even members of the majority party, the ability for our nation to control its pollution, to do our fair part in addressing the global climate change is very important to us, is very important to each of our constituencies. We've also heard, though, that there are penalties if we go and institute a nationwide carbon tax, a carbon tax that's going to not only address carbon, but also is going to address all forms of pollution across our nation, such as fracking and others, where we get a percentage of our income, a large percentage of the money that supports our common citizens from that. We also have heard that, the tax is supposed to penalize companies that each of our constituents are employed by, that make their money by. The majority party admitted that a carbon tax scheme is a regressive tax, and a regressive tax that will affect our citizens, and a regressive tax that will actually affect the economic future of our nation. We on the opposition believe there's many ways to address this challenge. Regulatory change is one that is not accompanied by a regressive tax like this carbon tax. And we also agree that the whole climate issue is one that is not only for our great country to address, but one that we must address as part of the international group of countries that have come together to address this problem. The majority party mentioned Ukraine. Ukraine is unfortunate because not only is the human suffering and toll going there, but Even the war itself has added to the greenhouse gas emissions and others with what's going there. So, as members of the opposition, number one, we sincerely hope that the hostilities in Ukraine are ceased as soon as possible. Secondly, we really hope that as we work together in our great nation, we can use our science, we can use our technology, we can use the greater common sense of the people in our country to look at the appropriate regulatory actions, to look at the appropriate economic actions. The economy is one a great way to get companies to adjust. If you don't buy something from a company, they won't produce it. So we have many, many ways to address this issue, and a regressive tax that, once implemented, will never go away and just go up, and that unfairly uh, affects those in our nation who are least able to afford its impacts, is one that we should not pass at this time. But we should work together on more creative solutions to solve this problem that affects our great nation. So thank you to the other members of the parliament, uh, and let's solve this problem together for our great nation.
Thank you, Professor David Smith. Now I request for the closing remarks our Honorable Prime Minister of the Parliament, Professor Rob.
So both sides are in violent agreement that additional taxes should be avoided if possible. Where we disagree is whether carbon taxes should remain in the government's quiver or should be taken out of it. If you're repairing an automobile or a tractor or a truck, you have a tool set. You don't pick up a screwdriver and say, I don't really like the screwdriver, so I'm going to throw it out, because there might be a time you're going to need it. Taxation is one of the most effective tools the government has to regulate behavior. I will absolutely agree that often governments misuse that tool, and the end result is a regressive tax that hurts the very people that you want to help. Our proposal is not to use this as a default, to use this as an absolute penalty for companies and industries that otherwise cannot correct the problem. Use it as a penalty. Certainly, we would use our version of the anti-competitive control structure to make sure that companies don't collude, because we could certainly see an industry could collude, could accept the tax and just pass it on to their consumers. That would be a bad outcome. In effect, the company therefore isn't paying the carbon tax. The very people we're trying to help who aren't creating the problem are the ones paying the tax. That would be an adverse outcome. And if that were the outcome of applying the carbon tax, we wouldn't support it either. So the tax has to be applied less like triage, where you walk in and just kind of hit everybody over the head with a tax and exit, and more like a scalpel. We use it to correct the behavior for the highest polluters and in areas where the pollution can't be mitigated in any other way. We use it as part of a carrot and stick program to create incentives for companies to correct the pollution at its source, and so they don't incur a carbon tax, and the end result become more competitive with their peers that have not. We use the economic engine that we co-control as the government to drive the behavior in the industry that we want. Now, one thing is clear: we can't do nothing. The water's getting more polluted as we go forward. The ocean's getting more polluted as we go forward. Our citizens are ingesting plastic at ever-increasing rates. Our air is often unbreathable. And the level of sickness is trending up. And we have to comprehensively address those problems by eliminating the things that cause them, and those things are pollutants. And again, not being the secondary benefit here is climate change. It's not the primary benefit. The primary benefit is clean air, clean water, and available food in sufficient quantities to have a decent life. The goal is to use every tool in our quiver to assure the long lives and happiness of our citizens. And one of those tools would be a carbon tax or ability to tax. And very well may be, working with the opposition, we come up with some other way to tax the bad behavior of the companies. But we're limited. The tax is a powerful tool, but for instance, going in and taking over those companies, which is also something we could do to solve the problem, is something that would be problematic because government just isn't really good at running companies. We could use that tool too, and I'm not suggesting we remove it, but I'm suggesting that one would come after carbon tax, not before. So the government argues that carbon tax become one of our arrows in our quiver, and that we use it when appropriate, but use it surgically to address the behavior and use it in a way that it does not benefit international companies over our own industries, but benefits our companies over international providers. And particularly, we look at heavy industries in countries that are heavy polluters, and use our other taxing priorities like tariffs to make their goods less attractive to our citizens, so that we are aggressively addressing the pollutants on a global scale as much as we can, but predominantly focused on the pollutants that we're creating as a country, and focused on those pollutants that are addressing our own citizens predominantly. Again, the goal of this administration is to assure the long life, health, and happiness of our citizens, and the carbon tax is one of the tools we want to use that, but not the predominant one, and only one of the things that we use to affect a positive change and create a better country for ourselves, for our loved ones, and particularly for our children. Because one of the big issues we've got is these pollutants. They build up over time, and it may not be us that pays the penalty. It may be our children or our children's children if we don't address this. And there's really nothing more important than saving our children. And removing any tool we have to help do that is part of our proposal, and the government rests.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, Mr. Rob. Thank you, all of our speakers, because today we're going to discuss very, very important thing for climate change, carbon tax. Even though for developing world, because I'm representing Asia, and our debate also in Asian parliamentary debating format. I want to give thanks all of our speakers, because you bring different views. What is the benefit of carbon tax and what kind of disadvantage it has? Definitely USA, most of the advanced countries, so they have good models the developing nations can follow. But most important thing is that there are many countries like China, even India, and other countries. They are actually polluting this environment. So we need to be very much careful about that. And most important thing is that I believe that we need to create more awareness to the developing nations. Even last sessions, I told that even in the Asia Pacific, even in specifically Malaysia, I asked what is sustainable development goal. I believe 90% organizations and people, they do not understand how this SDG work. So that is the reason actually World Talent Economy Forum arranging more dialogue, debate, and we heavily sharing our content in social media, through email, and through our personal contact. We have to create a real awareness. Even last October, when we attend this public-private partnership in Dubai Expo and COP26 dialogue, that time we also find many developed nations and the chief of the country from the developing world, they attend in the COP26, but we need better outcome. We need more action. We need more collaborations and partnership in between developed world and developing nations for solving this climate change, because climate change, it's not for individual countries problem, it's a global problem, and we need to work together for this particular issue. That's why World Talent Economy Forum always bring this topic, climate change. uh, my family also one of the sufferer for this climate change issues. So definitely with this kind of dialogue and some good project developments in developing nations and in the developed world, maybe we can solve this climate change related problem. Thank you, Professor Rob, Professor David Smith, Professor David J. Kelly, Professor Donald, and Mr. Marshall for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. As well as before this session, we declared already we declared our good things with our partners. Now we have more than 300 university, corporation, business forum, government bodies from developing nations and developed world. They are our partners. We develop our team, and soon next week we're gonna discuss. But before that, I have to discuss with our team because already different chamber of commerce and governments they request us to arrange some high quality conference, as well as they want to invite all of our speakers to Asia. Even some university we are discussing in India, they are looking for some vice chancellor, and maybe any of our speakers can be the vice chancellor for the universities, because that is the objective of World Talent Economy Forum. When a high quality professors or corporate person, it's my personal experience. I helps to grow United Group, one of the largest group of companies in Bangladesh. So when like high quality like executive or professor, they go to the developed nation. They do not only develop their department; they actually develop whole ecosystem, which is important for developing world, which is by like knowledge sharing, experience sharing. That is the concept of World Talent Economy Forum. I want to invite our speakers, our mentors to the developing nations, and definitely we are negotiating with more Chamber of Commerce and largest corporation. They are very happy to invite you all in the developing nations. Maybe it can be an excellent contribution for us. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.